Thank you to all of you for making the time to come on our podcast today. I'm Megha Bahree. I'm a fellow at the Esya Centre, and today we'll be talking about why is it important to report on technology, on startups, on the business of tech, and the impact of tech. Where do journalists go wrong? Where are the lessons we can learn? And how do we make this, and it's a very important topic, and why is it important? And just for our readers and our viewers, how do they differ between a good tech story and a bad tech story? And what's at stake when it comes to a bad tech story? Why is that problematic? And I'm going to introduce our guests one by one briefly. I'm going to start with Nitin Sethi. Nitin is a veteran journalist in India. He's worked everywhere across beats and especially on tech. He is now running something known as the Reporters Collective, which is a bunch of freelance journalists who've come together and do deep dive stories and doing stellar work over there. And then we have Ayushman Kaul. Ayushman is a senior analyst in the UK, and he's going to be bringing us some of his tech insights on the work that he has translated into journalism. And then we have Pete Guest. Pete is, again, another seasoned tech reporter. He's currently the enterprise editor at Rest of World, but he's worked at multiple global organizations before that. So just to start out, I just want to lay out the land of where we are right now. So last year, India crossed $200 billion in revenue in the IT sector. That obviously covers the big IT services companies, but also includes more than 25,000 startups that we have in the country today. There were something like, I think, 41 unicorns last year, which is a big deal in the Indian press, grabs headlines all the time. So that's kind of the lay of the land that we're dealing with. Nitin, if you can start with what does it mean to cover this sector? What do you see happening in the Indian media and what's good and bad about it?
Sure. Thanks, Megha, for having me here. To me, it's always looking at the business of tech industry and how the economics and the business operations of tech industry flourishes or fails in India. And the other side is looking at how tech involves itself in issues of governance, alteration, societal relationships, dynamics between malpractices, and just lives of our everyday citizens being impacted by technology. And not to sound too skeptical, but at this stage, I think we've been as gilded-eyed about it as Indian journalism has often been about a new upcoming sector in India. There was a point when you saw basic infrastructure of IT industry come up and all looking at it from these tainted eyes, saying, "Oh, amazing new industry coming up, we're becoming international characters, etc., etc." And I think that kind of a not so skeptical view of the industry still flourishes in how we in journalism look at both the business of technological industries and the deployment of these technologies in different parts of our lives and governance. On the business side, I think we're doing far worse than understanding technology, simply because our coverage of business at large in the corporate world at large has been pretty dismal in the last 20 years, post-liberalization, I'd say. We've been used to taking handouts from the industries and writing what they wanted us to do with a little bit of flourish color on the back and the forth. And more or less, I think that's what we've ended up doing with the flourishing technology industry in India. We look at these startups as job providers, therefore the difficulty in not writing against them very often. There's a public mood that favors them at the moment because there's not much happening, as you know, in the Indian economy. We're tanking slowly in the last couple of years. Our tech reporting, on the other hand, has been what I would think amateur attempts by journalists trying to claim that they understand technology. And it's been a brave new world for them. If you know Indian journalism well, most of us who've come to Indian journalism, particularly in the last 2 decades, have had very few skill sets except hopefully at times the ability to write a decent story. Understanding of subjects has been dismal for many years, particularly when it came to issues of science and economics. These are two areas I think we've been particularly weak. And we've had a third challenge that generally in Indian society, we look up to science as this miasmic, some high perch animal which is supposed to be preyed and is considered as some whole cow. And that's made it difficult for us to peel off layers and understand how these things work. Three, I think, as we've seen in many other parts of the developing world, particularly, some of the best technological coverage or coverage of technology and its use in society, I think it's come out of collaborations between journalists and technologists working very closely with each other, whether on record or off record. Very often journalists don't give credit to people behind the scenes who really help them understand things. But I think it's been particularly true of how good work I've seen in Brazil and elsewhere that's happened. It's happened because there were quiet collaborations, sometimes very formal collaborations. Indian newsrooms, legacy newsrooms, are particularly not created in a fashion where they allow these collaborations to happen. So they've been laggards. Partly out of reluctance, partly out of just being large mammoths that don't move very quickly to changing times. We've seen new newsrooms, and Ayushman's here who's done work with The Wire, others who've been bravely attempting to do this. The challenge for, I think, a lot of these brave new newsrooms, as I call them, and boutique newsrooms at times, is the sheer resources you require to tackle a subject which is not your average journalist daily bread and butter. And the layers of sifting through you require before you turn something which you know is a revelation into something which is readable, because you've digested it so well that you can then let someone else taste it as good. And that's surely a function of resources, I think. It's not, in India's case, there's no lack of desire, there's no lack of enterprise by journalists and these new platforms to try and grapple with it. But surely the levels of editorial cleansing, if I may say so, that needs to be done before the story is readable, even by a small, minuscule audience, which has a general sense of what and say. I mean, I keep saying, some of my colleagues are doing this investigation for a year, and they started with writing on something which is deep dive, has taken a year and a half. And I keep saying, go back, and unless you can explain an algorithm to an average citizen, your story is going to go in the dumps. Because most of us don't even understand what an algorithm is. We use these terms very generically, but it doesn't make sense to most people. Also, I think...
Can you tell your mother what the story is?
Exactly. And even if not my mother, at least my daughter who's playing with the phone every day still understands there's something at the back of the phone that makes it work. I'm not even trying to reach my mother at this moment. Just those kids who at least use their phones everyday basis. And I do see there's a difficult ask for... what does journalism do in some sense, which happens across all boards? To me, we're able to digest information that is not something that was taught to us on day one, but as journalists, we picked up a subject, worked on it for 2-3 months, hopefully. And 2-3 months is a luxury in Indian journalism, as we all understand. Digest it well enough to at least be comfortable in your skin when you go out speaking authoritatively on it. Now, it's an art. I think very often journalists don't know half of what they're writing on, but at least to come off fairly authoritative in that you've not said what you don't understand. And that takes it takes layers of labor. It takes a third eye, a fourth eye, which has no clue about the subject, and yet typically what the editors and fact checkers will do. And I do think it's a matter of time before we reach that point that we'll be able to do this better. The part about covering the business world of technologies, of understanding how their economics work, how do they do their businesses, how do they flourish, what kind of contracts they sign at the back end, that I think is going to be terribly more difficult for us, simply because journalism in India is restrained not to tap that very well and understand that very well. And there, an interplay of understanding pure economics, how markets work, how contractual agreements happen, what are the rules and regulations in India, that overlaps with technology and with the ability of storytelling. I think that's the most complicated because it's hugely interdisciplinary in its nature to do that. And I must admit, even with what I've seen in a lot of what would be first world media or developed world media, it's not as if they've done a great deal also. If you were to look at on a PPP basis, for every dollar that put into it, what comes out of it, I think for the pennies that we're putting in India into it, we're doing fairly well. But there is a huge distance for us to go.
Ayushman, moving to you. I mean, you've worked on an investigative series with a colleague of yours. Can you tell us what that was about, how that came about, and just how did it work out? Yeah, if we could start with that.
Sure. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real delight to be here to speak about the Tek Fog investigation in the company of such seasoned journalists as well. I had the opportunity to work on this investigation, which was a 2-year investigation with my colleague Devesh Kumar. And through this investigation, through initially a whistleblower who claimed to have access and be working on behalf of the ruling party and have access to a highly secret and sophisticated app that allowed them to carry out a number of mass social media manipulation operations concurrently, we were able to kind of dig deeper into this and discover the existence of this kind of secretive app, which was called Tek Fog, MyCloud. It had a number of names. And some of the 4 kind of key features that we found it was able to do. The first one was to be able to manipulate, basically bypass the automation and verification features on a number of major social media platforms in a way that allowed them to essentially manipulate and amplify trends and engineer essentially popular trends. So in particular, they could hijack the trending section of Twitter, for example, or trend content, although there's no trending section on Facebook, but trend content on Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, almost kind of every major social media communication platform that we're using. Aside from this, they were also had the ability to essentially use a phishing technique to begin with that allowed them to hijack inactive WhatsApp accounts of individual citizens and then use their WhatsApp account, their token as it were, to send messages to either their frequently contacted or all of their contacts. So they could essentially impersonate a person's inactive WhatsApp account and then use that account to amplify messages or conduct whatever operations they may want to do. Beyond that, they also, all of these operatives who were working with this app, Tek Fog, they also had access to a large dynamic database of individual citizens that were categorized according to their profession, religion, ethnicity, language. And shockingly, in the cases of some categories, for example, with regards to Indian women, or especially women working in journalism, categorized according to protected personal characteristics, including their breast size, including their skin tone. And beyond this, one of the other really alarming features was that they had the ability to auto-retweet or auto-remap the accounts that they were managing via this app, and essentially delete them on a moment's notice in case any of these assets caught too much attention. So kind of and there's still a lot more of this investigation. We've published 4 parts to this. There's more that we're going to be publishing going ahead. But really what this speaks to, and what we hope that is conveyed through this, is the idea that the days of, a troll farm with maybe 100 people sitting and just manually clicking on posts, that may exist some places. But really this industry, this kind of social media manipulation industry, this digital manipulation or influence operations industry has reached a level of technical and economic sophistication, which means that the access to the kind of techniques and the ability for them to influence mass discourse or public discourse is extremely significant, and in the sense that we have to, as a whole, understand that this industry, I mean, this disinformation as a profit industry, which some people call it, or influence operations as a service, as a kind of commercial service industry, is a very large and growing industry, which is seeing, in this case, we saw almost a kind of collusion between individuals who are belonging to the social media sphere, so individuals who are working with Mohalla Tech Private Limited, which is the holding company of ShareChat, Persistent Systems, which is a large technology services consultancy, as well as members of the BJYM, which are the youth wing of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party. So you can see there's this kind of collusion between social media, tech, as well as kind of corporates, to provide these services on a scale that is kind of unprecedented in terms of its sophistication and ability to exert influence over essentially what people consider to be popular information, true information, considered to be a valid opinion that is being expressed by people online. Essentially, all of these things are now capable of being manipulated, which is quite shocking.
Ayushman, I just want to clarify a couple of things. So you're obviously not a traditional journalist like Nitin and Pete. So did the whistleblower come to you, and because you understand technology, you could dig deep into what the whistleblower was, giving you a heads up about, or, flagging to you, and understand and dig deep at what was going on, and then you took it to the wire to potentially write about it? Is that how it kind of came about?
Yeah, so essentially my background is working more in private risk consultancy. I was working as a security analyst. From then onwards, I kind of got into the threat intelligence space because I was working with the Atlantic Council's DFR lab, where I was a South Asia research analyst. So I was covering South Asia for the DFR lab, which is one of the kind of foremost, essentially, digital forensic researcher organizations. So they work on, for example, coordinated inauthentic behavior operations. They work alongside enforcement agencies to kind of combat extremism online. They do open source analysis, as well as kind of investigative workshops, and teach them to kind of journalists and civil society members. So, I mean, through that, I kind of fell into this field through that. But really, this investigation is something that I think a lot of people who are kind of studying this space, as I kind of began to work in this space and write about this space. So, for example, I've done a lot of work on terror groups' use of encrypted messaging platforms. That was usually that was kind of my beat, as it were, before I kind of started this investigation. And also, when this investigation started, it was kind of a public source, i.e. in the sense that the source was on publicly posted on Twitter, and there were a number of journalists that reached out to them at that time. But at the end of the day, I think the reason that we fell into it was because we were persistent insofar as we were examining this field. We were beginning to understand how kind of influential the ability to harness such technology can be, especially when it comes to the kind of discourse wars that take place within India already. So when we kind of began with this claim that there was this app that we had not heard of, that it was purely this, technical curiosity, like what is this app, what could it possibly do? It was literally this technical curiosity that initially sparked this investigation. But then as we continued pursuing it, and I think one of the main reasons, I would say, despite the fact that we were not working at a really, huge media organization or had like a large following, I think we were very persistent with this story. There were a lot of other people who perhaps began but didn't want to sit for 2 years, sifting through the weeds and trying to essentially go through every kind of nook and cranny of this investigation. I mean, I think as Nitin mentioned at the beginning, we usually face a very kind of immediate news cycle type of pressure, especially in this space where it's like, well, what are you going to publish now? So when at that point, we hadn't even approached The Wire. So this was a purely independent investigation to begin with, because we realized that before we can even get them to be interested, or even believe us rather, we had to be able to provide enough research and groundwork to take it to that stage. So that's kind of what we did for at least 6 months before we even approached The Wire, and that's when we started our collaboration with them.
How was your story received when it finally ran?
So I think it's a strange one. I mean, on one hand, there are some aspects of the release that are still kind of ongoing, in the sense that, for example, the issue of Tek Fog was raised in Parliament by a number of opposition politicians. The government's response to that was, we searched on the App Store and Google Store, Play Store, and we could not find any Tek Fog. And I cannot believe that this is what I am trying to repeat, but this is legitimately what their argument was, that we searched on the paid app stores and we couldn't find this app. So I mean, there is a lot more to be asked of the government in terms of having to explain how this kind of operation could have been set up under their watch or under their kind of jurisdiction. But beyond that, I think what was really, I guess, heartening for me is that the stories themselves, despite the fact this is a very new field, despite the fact that this is in many ways, while we had to be careful to not be entirely technical and dry in the story, because I believe this is inherently a human story more than it's a technology story. I mean, it's about how technology is being used, deployed against Indian citizens. So in my opinion, this is a human story. But the fact is that having to communicate that without providing enough technical details, while at the same time being able to communicate that human element of it without straying too far away from just saying, look, this is what we found and this is what we could verify. I think that was a really interesting challenge. And we had millions of people read that article, which is, I think, also testament to the fact that there is a growing audience for these kinds of stories in India, which I had not known prior to this. I mean, so for me, that was really heartening to see. But I do believe there is still a lot more that needs to be done, at least in terms of putting pressure on the institutional actors involved to answer for this operation, and also in general for us to be a bit more, kind of again reiterating what Nitin said, to be a bit more skeptical of these large social media companies, to be a bit more skeptical of these organizations, and also just demand better. I think one thing, I may be rambling a bit, but one thing that really was for me a bit shocking was the number of people who read the investigation and said, well, I think people do engage in social media manipulation, but in this case, this was targeted harassment of specific subsections of the population for the purposes of sowing social enmity. And I think that goes much beyond any kind of, well, I guess there's this kind of thing happens. This is something that should not be occurring in a democracy. And as citizens, I can only speak about our democracy. I would say that it's up for us to demand a lot better. I mean, especially from the tech space, especially in terms of the regulation of our data, with regard to sunset clauses about our data, with regard to who has access and control over this data. We seem to have a very kind of laissez-faire attitude, which I think needs to end.
So, Pete, just moving on to you. Obviously it was a groundbreaking investigative series, but I think one of the criticisms that came up was that it was, Nitin's daughter could not necessarily have processed it because it was pretty tech heavy. So, Pete, as you cover technology, not just for India, but across the world, across many developing countries, what is the role do you think journalists have? I mean, can journalists team up with technologists, with people who have way more expertise and knowledge than us? And how do we make that more user-friendly, so to speak, and actually have the impact that one hopes to have?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things that we've seen over the past, I would say, half a decade is that more and more journalists are working with technologists. They are working with other experts, and more technologists, more academics are actually willing to be quite brave and challenge the power structures in the industries, because previously that they wouldn't want to do that. This was the water they swam in. And I think one of the main benefits of working with other organizations, whether that's open source intelligence, whether that's technology specialists, is that they see things we don't, particularly because they see things in a systematic way. We're often reporting at the margins of companies. We're reporting the margins of issues. We're looking for stories, which isn't the same as looking for the systematic understanding of what a company is doing, what an issue looks like. And I mean, I think that ability to scale our reporting up to understand things in a much more complicated and nuanced, but also more kind of large, broader way is incredibly relevant. And the other thing is also, often, as Nathan said, we don't have the skills. We've had leaks that someone comes to us and says, this is incredible, this is massively exciting, this is enormously relevant, and you open it up and it's just 100 pages of symbols. And you think, I don't know what I'm looking at. And you need somebody there who has the technical skills, who has the knowledge, who has the understanding to look at it and go, oh yeah, this matters. So I think that's an incredibly exciting trend in the industry, and I think it's very, very, very cool to me that these skills are coming into newsrooms directly now. So either directly with employees, with partnerships, with open source intelligence works, and I think that narrow definition of what a tech journalist is changing quite fundamentally.
If you can just take a step back from all of this, Pete, and lay out for us, because you're seeing this in multiple geographies and in multiple countries, can you just lay out for us why is it important to report on tech? What is at stake? And how can that backfire?
I mean, I don't think there's a much more eloquent demonstration of why this matters than Ayushman's work. I think something that I think about a lot is that technology isn't really a subject anymore. It's the environment that everyone operates in. It's regardless of what you think your beat is, it's affected by technology. It cuts across everything. You can't operate in any of the traditional beats that were there when I was coming up without some foundational understanding of technology and the businesses behind it. And as Ayushman said, it's a human story. So much of our daily interaction is mediated with technology. Our experience of global events, as we're seeing in Ukraine, is mediated through technology platforms and the decisions that those technology platforms make. Our experience of the economy is mediated through technology and the payment systems that we use in the commerce platforms that we use. Even our experience of geography can be mediated through technology, through mapping. So I was thinking about this morning. Thursday, I've just come back from Cairo, and on Thursday I took an impromptu tour of the western part of the city because Uber tried to take us on a road that didn't exist yet. And while that's a kind of funny little story, if you think about it, at one end you've got a driver who lost 30 minutes in Cairo traffic because of a mapping error. That means he probably missed his targets, he missed his earnings, he lost income. The systems, the mapping, the fees, the targets, the incentives, all of those are decisions made by somebody, by an executive, by a technologist, by an investor. And that's, I think, why this matters. That we use technology very intuitively these days, but we don't understand how it's built and what decisions it's based on. And I think that's why it matters.
Is there a good tech story from a bad tech story when it comes to all these issues?
Be careful how I say this. Yes, absolutely there is. I think a good technology... Well, I'll start with a bad one because I think it frames it. A bad technology story is one which is credulous. It's one which leads towards the idea that tech is a solution, it will save us. And I think for a very long time there was a reverence towards this kind of mythic great entrepreneur. And you still see it, name names, we should. You see it with the Elon Musks of the world who become almost sacred entities. They can't be challenged and they have the solution. Whether that's internet by satellite or electric vehicles, they have the solutions. And uncritically getting overexcited by this, I think as Nitin said this earlier, and not diving into the business models, not diving into the decisions, not diving into the impacts, leads us into dangerous territory. And I don't want to maybe overstate it, but I think that some of the issues we're seeing, the misinformation, the mainstream information manipulation, financial behaviours that are somewhat risky, political tensions that have been amplified by algorithms, these could have been limited with a little less credulous reporting early on. But, the converse, I think a good story is one that understands that technology has all those different stakeholders. It isn't just a CEO sitting on bean bags in an office with pastel coloured walls, right? It's customers, it's clients, it's other employees, it's people on the ground who are affected by the actions of those companies. I think that, again, that's something that's changed over the past few years. There's more people, I think, like myself, like Nitin, who maybe didn't start off as technology journalists, get thrown into the field, that you start thinking, well, maybe the story doesn't begin in the boardroom. It begins on the ground in Myanmar. It begins with the drivers who are desperately trying to make a 15-minute delivery. And I think now we are in that environment where you might start an investigation in that way. And I think that's what makes a good story, is it understands, as Ayushman said, these are human stories.
So when we tackle these human stories, and this is more of a journalism classroom question, but I think the more we get into writing about tech, how much of the technology terms do you bring into the story? How much do you explain them? Do you have to explain what is phishing? What is a phishing attack? What is misinformation? How is it different from disinformation? And, is that also a role we have to do to educate readers who are not in the same place as we are? Or am I thinking too much of ourselves?
No, I mean, look, I think I'm probably one of the first generation of journalists who didn't have to explain what the internet was on first mention, right? So there's always going to be a balance, but this is traditional journalism skills, right? Is this clear? Am I showing off? Am I showing people what they need to see? Am I repeating what a tech company's told me? Because they love to use jargon to slightly confuse the facts. I think that's very much, it is a journalism classroom question, but it's still one we have to get right. And I think, again, as I said earlier, the blending of tech journalism with other things has made that better. We are better at getting what's relevant and explaining what we need to explain. But yeah, it's an ongoing challenge.
And what do you think? How do you think one can work with technology experts like Ayushman? I mean, I think people are hungry to do, journalists are hungry to do the important stories, so-called important stories, right? We can definitely do the human impact, like the delivery guys, right? We can do that on our own. But if we have to look at the story of the tech and the impact of what's happening behind the scenes on the tech, I can't do that. I don't know if you can, but Ayushman can help us do that, right? So how do we cross those bridges? Is there an active? Are journalists actively trying to do that, or should they be trying to do that?
They definitely should be. I think they are. I mean, to blow our own trumpet, I think we try and do it as much as possible, although, again, not systematically. I think it's a lot more case by case. I think it comes down to, as it does with any investigation work, right? It's building relationships. It's building up the contacts, building up the trust, and also aligning your incentives. I think a lot of the times we think about investigations as being whistleblowing, right? Someone comes to you with something. But actually, in this field, because of how opaque it is, because of how difficult it is to understand an algorithm, even if you are a quite mathematically minded journalist, you are not going to be able to understand something which has been built by teams of computer scientists who are experts in machine learning. You can maybe see the impact. So the investigation really comes from unwinding what that means, like trying to understand what decisions it is making, what data it is taking in, where those biases are being introduced, and that's something where you have to figure out who else cares about this. Who else wants to reveal this? Academics are a fantastic source for this because this is what they do. But again, sorry, I've gone on a ramble there, but I feel like the most important way to do it is to build trust. There are people that you work with for years and years and years, and finally they come to you and they say, I've just found. And that's what this is. And again, the field is really new, right? I'm very hopeful that give it a few more years and we're going to start seeing those people who've left big tech companies, who have all the skills, who understand what algorithms look like. They go into academia, they go into individual research, they become whistleblowers. They get the trust with the journalists who've only been covering the gig work sector, for example, which is barely a decade old. It'll start happening more systematically, I hope.
Guys, thank you so much, all of you, for your time today. It was really interesting, and I look forward to speaking with you another time. Thank you.